Many miles from the beautiful city of Seattle, over the Cascade Mountain Range into eastern Washington, lies the Mineral Springs Restaurant on Blewett Pass. It's a tranquil setting with tall trees, babbling brooks, and a wide assortment of wildlife. Boyd and Fran Grant own and operate the restaurant, which is known for consistency, quality, and totally homemade food. One of the biggest draws continues to be the fantastic baked desserts created by Margie Sage.
They are just simply delicious, and the crust just melts in your mouth. They really are good.
Well, I like pretty much all the flavors of pies. I suppose that might show a little bit, but my favorite way to enjoy our pies is probably like possibly December, January, to drop down off the top of the mountain with my snowmobile and work my way down through the trails down to the restaurant. By that time I've worked up a pretty good appetite and I enjoy the pies that much more.
Everything about the pie is good. It's just real good homemade pie.
I think that the biggest thing that I can see is the professionalism of it. It's not like going down to a bakery in town and buying a pie. To me, it's just an entirely taste. It's home cooking, and that's what I like.
In fact, it's rumored that people from Seattle, 150 miles away, have called to reserve a piece of pie before traveling eastward. Margie, is that true?
Yeah, but don't take my word for it.
A lot of people have stopped here from Seattle, and they have eaten her pies. And they call ahead lots of times to make sure that she's going to have pies ready for them when they come back across the mountains.
And we come from Seattle a lot just because of the food in Margie's pies. And we go to, through the Loop and to Mount Rainier, and it's definitely worth the trip just to come by here, as well as the view. I mean, the scenery is wonderful.
Margie grew up on a ranch in Northern California and started cooking from scratch at a very young age. She sold pies through a local restaurant in her hometown and quickly developed a loyal following. Over the years, she continued to develop her skills baking for other restaurants using her old-fashioned, made-from-scratch recipes. Eventually, she was convinced by family and friends to share her recipes with others. Oh, Taste and See is Margie's cookbook packed with old-fashioned, made-from-scratch recipes from the heart of a country baker. Margie has done her share of teaching, too. In fact, she is currently instructing Jolene Kelly to take over most of her baking duties at Mineral Springs.
Eventually, Margie will be moving on to other things, and she has taken me under her wing here at Mineral Springs to take over for her when she's gone. And her cookbook is a wonderful way to learn. It has a lot of good techniques in it, and she says that I'm using them to the best of my ability, and I hope I can always do that for her and keep the memory of her here at Mineral Springs alive.
And now it's your turn to learn how to make pies with tender, flaky crusts and the most delicious fillings and toppings you can imagine.
Hi, I'm Margie Sage. I want to share with you my methods and techniques for making the best pie you've ever eaten. We're having friends up to our mountain cabin tonight for dinner, and I plan to make them a lemon meringue pie. The points I want to cover are the utensils necessary for making pie baking easier, how to make a tender, flaky crust, how to make a meringue that melts in your mouth, how to make your pie pretty, and common mistakes to avoid. So let's get started. The utensils you'll need are mixing bowls, measuring cups, measuring spoons, whips, pans, spatulas, a pastry cloth which keeps your crust from sticking to your counter. And I love these things. They're called a stockinette. They cover your rolling pin and keeps your crust from sticking to the rolling pin. They're sold in packages of 2 and also in sets. You'll need pie weights to weight down your single crusts while they're baking. And then this is one of the greatest tools. It's called a pastry blender, and it's used to cut the shortening into the flour. So let's make a tender, flaky crust. Now I'm going to make the crust for my pie tonight. I'm going to use 2 cups of flour. I use a little bit of sugar in my pie crust. It takes about 3/4 of a teaspoon, and 3/4 teaspoon salt. I like to mix the ingredients together before I add the shortening so that we don't have a spot in the pie crust that might be all sugar or all salt. So I mix it with a whip thoroughly before I add the shortening. I use 3/4 cup shortening. I'm going to measure it with a 1/2 cup and a 1/4 cup because it's easy just to put it in there and scrape it off. And a 1/4 cup. Complete my 3/4 cup amount. Just smash it in there and scrape it off. A good all-purpose shortening will work in pie crust. You do want to be sure it's all-purpose. Now the important part of the pie crust is to use a pastry blender. You don't want to smash it in with a fork or use a mixer because it will actually force the flour into the shortening. What we want to do is cut the shortening particles into small pieces and coat them with flour so that they will readily take the water and stick together, and it doesn't take very much water that way. If you mix the shortening into the flour or the flour into the shortening, then it takes a lot more water and you'll have tough pie crust. And this is one of the mistakes you want to avoid. So use a pastry blender because it cuts it in properly. You want to keep cutting this in until there's no loose flour left in your bowl. And you'll see that the mixture gets fine and then it starts to clump back together again. Take your pastry blender and scrape off the bottom of the bowl and bring the loose flour up on top so that you can cut it into the shortening more thoroughly. To me, this is probably the most critical part of having a tender, flaky crust, is doing this process properly. Again, too much loose flour will take too much water and it'll be tough. Okay, now you can see that I don't have any loose flour left in the bowl. It is possible to overwork your mixture also. You only want to bring it to the point where you don't see any more loose flour in the bowl. Now this is enough for 2 9-inch or a double crust 9-inch pie, and I don't want to moisten this whole mixture. If I do, the second crust will dry out too much and you'll have a terrible time with it. If you add enough water so that it doesn't dry out too much, then your crust is going to be tough. So I'm just going to take out what I need for a single crust pie. You want to take ice water so that the shortening doesn't melt until it goes into the oven. You want to just take a tablespoon at a time and then lightly toss it. You don't want to mix this any more than you absolutely have to. Take a little more ice water, sprinkle on the mixture, toss it again, just very lightly, carefully, bringing the bottom up so that the particles begin to clump together. Sometimes it takes 3 tablespoons of water, sometimes it only takes 1.5 tablespoons of water. It depends on the moisture in the air, and it also depends on the moisture in the flour. This is going to take just a little bit more, about 2.5 tablespoons. You don't want to skimp on the water or it'll be too dry and it'll crack, but you also don't want to use too much. You can feel it. If it just feels moist to the touch, you can tell that it has enough moisture. Now I'm ready for my pastry cloth. Put a little flour on it, sprinkle it around, and then rub it into the fibers of the cloth. This is so that the dough won't stick to the cloth and you won't get extra flour into your dough. And you take your rolling pin with a stockinette on it and roll it in the flour so that you also get flour into the fibers of the stockinette. You take your dough and just gather it into a ball, the side of the bowl, and then just lift it out and press it together. You want to lay this right on your cloth, and you don't want to roll it in the flour. You just, because you don't want to add any more flour to this than you absolutely have to. So you just set it on your cloth. Do not turn it over. Don't roll it and then turn it over. Just lay it down and flatten it out. Then take your rolling pin and start in the middle and roll a little bit in one direction, a little bit in the opposite, then in the other direction and the opposite direction. You may want to make sure to keep any cracks from forming, to press the edges together and roll it again and roll it again until you get a circle large enough for your pie plate. You want this about, you want it less than 1/8 of an inch thick. If it's too thick, it doesn't taste good. You want a light pie crust. It can also be too thin. So it's a little less than 1/8 of an inch and a little more than 1/16 of an inch. Take your pie pan and put it upside down on your crust, and then cut out approximately 1.5 inch from the edge of the pan. And just cut a circle. You want to be sure this is large enough, because if you don't cut it large enough, it'll shrink in your pie pan. Dough cannot be stretched. It'll always shrink a little when it bakes. So you want to be sure it fits your pan properly. You want to discard the trimmings, and another common mistake is to avoid is don't re-roll the trimmings. You want to handle pie crust like a delicate flour. Now to lift the crust up onto your pan, take your spatula and just hold it up against the edge of the rolling pin and then just roll it forward. Then pick it up. Now if you have a ball bearing rolling pin like I do, you want to be sure that you hold the main part of the rolling pin so it doesn't roll off. Pick it up and then just lay it down on your pan. And then just scoot it very carefully over so that it fits your pan evenly. Now you want to be sure that you force the dough down so that it fits snugly against the pie pan. Because again, the pie crust will shrink when it is baked, and you don't want it to shrink so that it doesn't fit the pan. So you fit it, push it down so it fits snugly. Just move it around, and you can feel it around the edge. Make sure it's snug. Now, to make the edge pretty, you want to fold the crust under and then just leave it standing up. You want to work quickly because your dough, if it doesn't have a lot of water in it, so that it'll be flaky and tender, and if you don't work quickly, it dries out and then it's harder to work with. Just work quickly, fold the edge under. You go all the way around. Now you want to flute it. What I do is I take my index finger and I just press the dough right over my index finger. And you just go all the way around the pie pan. Now, pie crust is actually very forgiving. It might not look too pretty until you do this. Now this is going to be for my lemon meringue pie. I'm going to take, I don't want to prick it with a fork like some recipes tell you to do so that it doesn't puff up during baking. I'm going to use pie weights. If you prick it with a fork, it makes holes in the crust, and then it allows a cream pie filling to become soggy, and the bottom crust will be soggy. You want to take a foil square, approximately the same diameter as your pie pan, fold it into quarters, and then cut a quarter circle. Then open it out. You'll notice there's a shiny side and a dull side. You want to place the shiny side down and the dull side up. This allows the bottom crust to bake. The shiny side will reflect the heat, and it will take longer for the bottom to get brown. Now this is where we put our pie weights and dump them onto top of the foil. And now your crust is ready to put into the oven. Now we're going to make a double crust pie. Take your ice water, sprinkle it on like we did before, stir it around. Lightly, just so the particles are moistened, so they'll stick together. You can see how it's clumping up. There's plenty of water on that, I can feel it. Gather it together. I need to put some flour on my pastry cloth. Roll it into my rolling pin on the stockinette. Gather the crust up and press it into a ball. Place it on the cloth. Push it down into a disc. And start to roll it one direction, then the other. Trying to keep it even. Make an even circle. Again, you don't want a thick crust. However, for a fruit pie, which we're going to make right now, the crust on the bottom can be a little thicker. Because the fruit is quite juicy and it'll tend to penetrate through the crust if it's too thin. Just roll this out to a large circle. Take your pan, turn it upside down, and this time we're not going to cut it 1.5 inches. We're going to cut it about 3/4 inch around the edge of the pan. Discard the trimmings. Now you can keep some of this trimming if you want to make cutouts for the top of your pie with little cookie cutters. Sometimes that's kind of fun, and it's fun to be creative with the top of your double crust pie. Again, take your rolling pin, roll the crust up on it, place it into the pan, slide it in till it fits, just carefully. Press it down like we did before to make sure it fits the pan snugly. There's no air bubbles under it. Turn it around, just pressing down, make sure it's... And take your filling. I have raspberry rhubarb combination. It's like strawberry rhubarb, only I have used raspberries instead of strawberries. I use frozen fruit, but you can use canned fruit. You just use a little less sugar in it. Or you can use fresh fruit. Spread it around till it's even. Take approximately 2 tablespoons of butter and cut it into little pieces. And then just dot the pie. This gives it flavor, adds richness to it. You can also use margarine if you prefer. And you want to pick up your plate and take your knife or spatula and just trim the edges to fit the edge of the pie plate. By doing this, you won't have a real thick crust on the edge. Now we're going to do the top crust. Some of your mixture in, moisten it. Stir it lightly. Add a little more water. Just stir it lightly. It feels just like it should be. I'm going to discard this. Get some flour, and you want to do this between each crust. Roll your rolling pin in it, because we don't want it to stick. Gather the crust again into the side of the bowl to a round ball, and pick it up, press it, set it down on your cloth, smash it down into a disc. Take your rolling pin and roll one direction and then the next. You'll notice that it doesn't stick to the rolling pin because of the stockinette. Now this can be a little thinner than the bottom crust. Again, you want this about, you want it less than 1/8 of an inch, but more than 1/16 of an inch. Roll it out. Take another pie plate, turn it upside down, and we're going to cut this about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch from the edge. If we cut it too large, we'll have too thick a crust on the edge. just place this over to the side. Pick up the pie plate. Place your rolling pin down. Roll the crust up on the pan, holding it. And then place it down on the pie. You can move it a little to even it up, but you want to handle it very carefully. Now on a 2-crust pie, you want to take the top crust and fold it down under the bottom edge to form a seal, and then let it stand up like we did with the single crust. This will seal the two together and keep the juices of this fruit pie inside where they belong. Just do that all the way around the pie. And have it stand up. Don't push it down against the edge of the pie plate. Just have the edge stand up, just like we did on the first one. Again, flute it, make it pretty. There are different ways to flute. Actually, this is kind of everybody's trademark. Everybody does this a little differently, and it looks a little differently, and that's just fine. It doesn't have to look just like mine. It doesn't have to look just like anybody's. You just develop your own style. Okay. Now you need to take your spatula or your knife and cut some air vents. Here, some people get real creative too, to make it attractive. This is to allow the steam to come out. Now you can, if you want to make this pretty, you can take some milk. Pour it into a cup or glass. And if you have a pastry brush, you can use that, or you can even use just a spoon and just lightly, the brush actually works the best. But you can just lightly cover the top of the pie with a little bit of milk. This will make a pretty glistening top. Just sprinkle a little sugar on top of that. This will give it a pretty glistening, sugary top. Now, before you put this into the oven, you want to take some foil strips, and in this case we're going to put the shiny side up, and you just conform the foil to the edge of the crust, and this will prevent the crust from burning. A fruit pie takes approximately an hour to an hour and a half, depending if the fruit is frozen or not, to bake. And if you don't cover the edges like this, they will burn, and they're not pretty and they don't taste good. They're burned. Now be sure you cover all the edges. Just form the foil rather snugly around the crust so it doesn't fall off. You don't want to hook it over the edge, you just want it right on top of the crust. You don't want it down over the edge of the pie plate. Now this pie is ready for the oven. Be sure your oven has been preheated to 425 degrees. Pastry needs to be put into a hot oven so that the moisture in the crust will evaporate quickly. A common mistake is to put a pie into a 350-degree oven thinking that it won't burn as quickly. However, this will change the texture of the crust and it won't be as flaky and tender as you'd like it to be. Now I'm ready to make that lemon meringue pie for our friends tonight. First thing I want to do is separate the eggs, the egg white from the egg yolk. It's easiest to separate the eggs when they're cold. That way you don't take the risk of getting egg yolk into the whites. If you get any egg yolk into the whites, they will not whip up. So you have to be very careful doing this. You do this process first so that the egg whites have a chance to warm up to room temperature. They beat up with more volume if they're warm. I'm using 5 eggs because I'm making a 10-inch pie. I'm going to set the egg whites aside so they'll warm up. I'm going to take 3/4 cup of cold water and put into the egg yolks and set those aside. And when I make a meringue, I put what I call a stabilizer into the meringue. This is a cornstarch gel. It's made with cornstarch and water. Takes a tablespoon and a half for a 10-inch pie. Takes 3 tablespoons of cold water. And you mix this thoroughly until the cornstarch is thoroughly dissolved. If you put cornstarch into hot water, it'll be lumpy. So you want this thoroughly dissolved. And then you add 3/4 cup of hot water. This speeds up the cooking process by using the hot water. Stir it so it's thoroughly mixed. We'll take the stabilizer to the stove and cook it until it's thickened and transparent, stirring it constantly. I cook this on a high heat so it'll cook quickly, but I stir it constantly so it won't burn. This is thickened and is now transparent, and it's ready to take off the heat and cool. The next thing you want to do is to take your lemons and squeeze the juice. You can use lemon juice concentrate. It gives your lemon pie a different flavor. I like to use all natural ingredients, so I always use fresh lemons in my lemon meringue pie. When you buy your lemons, look for the ones that have the thin skins. A thick-skinned lemon has a lot less juice in it than the thinner skinned. Also make sure they're soft because they will be juicier. When they're hard, they don't have as much juice in them. Takes about 3 lemons to make 3/4 cup. The next thing is the filling. This, for a 10-inch pie, this takes 1.5 cups of sugar. It takes 1/3, a heaping third. You want it heaping like this, not way up, but just a little over. Plus 1/8 cup for the 10-inch pie. Take your whip and stir this thoroughly. We're going to be adding hot water to this. And if the cornstarch and sugar is not thoroughly mixed together, the cornstarch will lump. I'm going to add 1 3/4 cup of hot water. And I use this type of whip to stir my cream fillings with. It has a flat surface and it covers more of the surface of a flat bottom pan, and it prevents burning on the bottom. You might want to take a spoon and just go around the edge of the pan. Sometimes the cornstarch and sugar will stick to the edge of the bottom of the pan, and then it'll burn when you're cooking it. A common mistake to avoid at this point is be sure you use stainless steel or glass to cook this in. If you use aluminum, it'll have a tendency to turn your cream pie or your lemon pie a tinge of green, and it's not really very pretty or appetizing. Next, I'm going to add the egg yolks that have 3/4 cup of cold water. You noticed I put hot water in this mixture. That's why the cold water is with the egg yolks, so that the egg yolks, when it hits the hot mixture, they don't cook and become lumpy. Mix the egg yolks with your whip thoroughly with the water and add them to your mixture. Stir it thoroughly. Now I'll add the lemon juice. We want 3/4 cup lemon juice for a 10-inch pie. Now I'm ready to cook the lemon filling. I cook this on a high heat, but I stir it constantly so it doesn't burn. Continue stirring this until it begins to thicken and becomes transparent. Cook it for about a minute after it starts to boil. You can see it bubbling there and boiling. I'm going to add 5 tablespoons of butter, approximately. And stir it in until it melts thoroughly. You don't want to see any melted butter. You want to be sure it's thoroughly mixed in so the pie will set up properly. Once the butter is thoroughly melted and it's thoroughly mixed in, so you can't see any melted butter on it, you want to pour it into your pie crust. Take a spatula and scrape out the pan. The next thing we need to do is the meringue. You want to put a meringue on a hot pie filling. It will help cook the meringue more evenly. Take the egg whites that you have set aside. We're going to add a teaspoon of cream of tartar. This makes the egg whites tender. I've pre-measured my sugar. I've used 2 tablespoons per egg white, so I have 10 tablespoons of sugar. I'm going to mix the meringue by hand. So I have found that you can underbeat egg whites, but you can also overbeat egg whites. If you have a powerful mixer at home, the tendency will be to mix for the egg whites to reach the volume that you want and the stiffness that you want before you actually have all the sugar into it. And you'll overbeat them. And then your meringue will fall after baking. Once the egg whites become frothy, start adding your sugar. You add it 1 tablespoon at a time. You want your sugar to thoroughly dissolve. If it doesn't, you'll have those little dewdrops on the top of your pie. Those are actually undissolved sugar crystals. And when they go into the oven, they melt. You want to beat this thoroughly before you add another tablespoon of sugar. I'm now adding the last of the sugar. I've added a total of 10 tablespoons of sugar, which amounts to 2 tablespoons of sugar per egg white. I'm going to continue beating this until it forms a soft peak. I have found it's pretty hard to overbeat egg whites if you do them by hand. If you do them with a high-powered mixer, you can overbeat it really fast, and then it causes the meringue to fall after it's baked. Now, to determine if this is done enough is to slowly pull your whip out of the meringue and then just pull it up. And if the peak stays upright and doesn't fall over, you know that it's ready. Now I'm going to add a pinch of baking soda. This will help your meringue stay high after it's baked. You just want to add a generous pinch of baking soda. And now we'll add the stabilizer. Stir this around a bit. Smooth it up. You just pour this on top of your beaten egg whites. Now be sure this is cooled. That's why we do it at the beginning. And then just fold this in. It's a slower motion, just to mix it in thoroughly with the egg whites. Now we want to put this meringue on a hot filling. And it's important to spoon this on around the edge of the pie. And you put it all around the edge first and make sure that you push the meringue up against the crust. This will ensure that the meringue seals to the crust and you won't have any air leaks. Meringue has a tendency to shrink a little when it's baked, and if it isn't pushed up securely against the crust, it'll pull away and then the air will get in there and it'll cause it to weep. You just very lightly want to spread this around. So you don't push out any of the air any more than necessary. And here's where You can use your own creativity to make your pie pretty. You can swirl it. You can do peaks. You can do whatever you would like to do. The peaks are a little soft at this point. But they bake out really pretty. Now your meringue is ready to go into the oven. I have preheated the oven to 350 degrees. Isn't this pretty? It has baked approximately 20 minutes in the oven. You put it on a rack to cool out of a draft. You don't want your pie to weep, therefore don't put it in the refrigerator to cool. Just leave it on a rack out of a draft for approximately 2 to 3 hours until it's thoroughly cooled before you cut it. At this point, I want to talk a little bit more about how to make pies pretty. One of the prettiest pies you can make is a fresh strawberry pie. The first thing you need to do after you wash your strawberries is to drain them on layers of paper toweling. You want to cut the strawberry in half if they're large. If they're small, you can leave them whole. And just place them the cut side down against the paper toweling. And then take another couple of layers of paper toweling and cover them. And blot them. You might want to do this ahead of time so that they have time to get all the moisture off. I've already made the glaze. The recipe for this is in my cookbook, or Taste and See. This is a homemade glaze that I've made from scratch. I've cooked it and I've allowed it to cool. If you put a hot glaze on fresh fruit, it'll cause the fruit to juice, and then that creates too much moisture and the glaze won't stick to the strawberries. And you take your strawberries that have been drained, and the first thing you do is place the side that hasn't been cut against the bottom of the crust. Generally, this side is drier. We don't want a soggy crust. I do this uniformly because when I'm done, this pie can be cut and it'll hold its shape on the plate and look really pretty. If you just put your strawberries into your glaze and then pour it into your crust, it doesn't always set up properly. Now, I want to put a thin layer of glaze over these strawberries. This will help keep the strawberries in place. I'll do another layer of strawberries, and I'm going to this time put the cut side of the strawberry down so that the uncut side is facing up. Just place the strawberries around the edge of the pie just like you did the first time. By layering the strawberries in this fashion and with the glaze, alternate layers of strawberries and glaze, you'll have a firmer pie that'll look prettier when you serve it. Now you put another layer of glaze. You want to use your glaze, it needs to be cool but not cold. If it gets too cold, then it's hard to work with. When you chill this pie, the glaze will firm up. I put 3 layers of strawberries. And again, you want to put the cut side down, the uncut edge up. Makes it prettier. Once you have it totally filled in, Put on the last layer of glaze. Make sure you have all the berries covered. The glaze is what keeps the berries together. There you have a fresh strawberry pie. Isn't that pretty? Now I'd like to share with you how I make a chocolate cream pie pretty. I've just whipped my whipping cream, to which I added some sugar and some unflavored gelatin that had been softened in a little bit of cool water and then warmed just enough to melt it. I've mixed it into the cream and then whipped it. The gelatin in the whipping cream will keep the topping on your pie from getting milky after it sits in the refrigerator for a couple of hours. And just lightly smooth it out so you don't lose any of the air in the cream. Then you take the back of a teaspoon and just pull up make little peaks. It's a kind of a wrist action. Just do some quick little pull-ups there with the whipped cream. I use a chocolate bar to make my chocolate curls, and the larger candy bars work better because they're thicker. And also, if they're room temperature, they curl better. If it's cold, it'll come off more in a crumb. Just slowly pull it towards you and let it fall off. There you have a chocolate cream pie with chocolate curls. Now I'd like to show you how I make the topping for a French apple pie. The first thing I've done here is mix brown sugar and flour together and put a cube of butter in there. And I'm going to cut the butter into the mixture with my pastry blender. You want to cut this in until there's no loose particles of the sugar-flour mixture. Now you take your apples, mix the cinnamon through. I haven't added sugar to these apples because they're very sweet. They're called a Spitzenberg apple. Make a wonderful tasting pie. Put them into your pie shell that has not been baked. Spread the apples out so they're evenly distributed. Take the crumb mixture, spread it out evenly on the top, and then we put the foil strips around the edge so that while this is baking, the crust won't burn. Again, I'm using the shiny side up. It's ready for the oven. Here's the pie.
Oh, that's beautiful, Margie. Thank you both for having us over this evening. This has really been a treat.
Oh, we're really glad you could join us.
You've seen me do it. Now I want to encourage you to give it a try. You'll do just fine. Just remember, good baking comes from the heart.